And with that, I am pleased to start our program tonight on the state of racial justice in Chicago by introducing you to our distinguished guest. First is Amanda Lewis, who is the director of the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy and distinguished professor of sociology and Black studies at UIC. Her research focuses on how race shapes educational opportunities and how our ideas about race get negotiated in everyday life. Next is David Stovall, who is a professor of Black Studies and Criminology, Law, and Justice at UIC. Professor Stovall brings theory to action by working with community organizations and schools to address issues of equity, justice, and to abolish the school-prison nexus. And our final panelist is Lisa Lee, who is the director of the National Public Housing Museum, an associate professor of art history and gender and women's studies at UIC. She is a cultural activist dedicated to creating spaces for dialogue and transformative dissent that reinvigorate civil society. Thank you, Professors Lewis, Stovall, and Lee, for being with us today and for having this important discussion with our alumni and friends. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Lewis to begin the program.
Thank you so much for having us tonight. We're really excited about having this conversation with UIC alumni and friends. For those of you who don't know about the Institute for Research on Race and Public Policy, we are a university-wide institute on campus. We see ourselves very much as supporting what the chancellor always says, that we are the university for Chicago. Our aspiration to be the premier urban public research university in the country. And a core part of the mission of the Institute itself is to increase society's understandings of the root causes of racial and ethnic inequality. And to that end, we've spent the last 4 years engaging with a number of scholars and community partners, like the folks we have with us here today, to produce and disseminate a series of reports on the state of racial justice in Chicago. In our reports, which you see the covers of here, we document the experiences and conditions of life in the city for different groups and ask ourselves and others over and over again, Chicago for whom? Across the reports, we find that racial and ethnic inequality in Chicago remains pervasive, persistent, and consequential, and that these inequities affect the lives of all Chicagoans in every neighborhood. They have not just spatial, but deep historical roots and are embedded in our social institutions. They have powerful effects on the lived experiences and opportunities of all Chicagoans. And they're not just a legacy of the past, but very much a result of persistent structural racism today. I promise to give a bunch of examples, including differential patterns of public and private investment in communities, different patterns of resource extraction from communities, different patterns of educational opportunity, and different patterns of policing. When we started this work, actually, we were really interested in capturing the full and complicated truth about racial dynamics in our city today, in part because we were really frustrated with popular narratives about Chicago at the time, which focused solely on stories about interpersonal violence. And we knew that the realities of Chicagoans' daily lives are far more complex. What we found is that while it's obviously important not to ignore the devastating impact of gun violence, the other hard truth that we must all face is that far more Chicagoans die early today from the effects of structural violence than they do from interpersonal violence. And by structural violence, we here referring to all the societal arrangements that put individuals and populations in harm's way. As public health scholar David Williams put it, one of his talks, several hundred Black folks in this country die early every day who would not die if the health of Blacks and whites were equal. And this is not just about access to health care or treatment in the healthcare system, but also about the way that racism gets into our bodies, into our economic structures, into our neighborhoods. Our plan for tonight is I'm gonna talk for about 25 minutes, and I'm actually setting a timer for myself. And I'm going to share some of the findings from our reports that I think help contextualize and help us understand the current moment that we're in. And then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Lee and David Stovall to help us understand more specifically about what we're seeing right now and also what we can do about it. I should say I'm also only going to be scratching the surface of these reports, and that anybody who's interested can download them for free from our website at irrpp.uic.edu. Okay, so now I'll get into the fun part. Okay, so this is some of the data from our first report, and I'm going to show you first some of the economic indicators that we look at. This first one we show, it maps out unemployment rate for Black, Latinx, and white communities. I should say that the first report focused on the 3 largest communities in the city, which are Black, Latinx, and white. They're each about a third. And then I'll show you some of the data from our subsequent reports on Asian Americans and Native Americans in Chicago. But one of the most important data points or things to think about when you look at this graph is it captures what we know to be true about unemployment for a long time, which is that Black unemployment has historically been 2 to 3 times white unemployment rates, and that Latinx unemployment rates are about twice as high. And this is important not only because it only includes those who are actively seeking work, so it doesn't include those who've just given up, and who we think of more as the chronic jobless, but because in this current moment, when we have national alarm around unemployment rates that people are saying are like what we haven't seen since the Great Depression, we often ignore that for African Americans in particular, they've been living with that reality for decades. And so, for instance, you can see on this graph that African American unemployment rates have been close to 19 or 20% or even higher for at least the last 40 or 50 years. And what seems like an alarm and an emergency nationally is what some folks have been living with on a daily basis for a long time. Another way to look at how different groups are doing in the city is to think about median family income. So this is income for an entire household. And this table compares the data looking at Chicago to the rest of the United States. There's lots of different things that you can see in this, but one thing that's worth looking at is how those things have changed over time. And these are all held at 2015 numbers. So we control for inflation and change over time. And what you see here is that the national story is that everybody's incomes have gotten incrementally higher over time. But the story in Chicago is much more complicated. Family incomes have gone up a little bit for Latinx families. They've gone up a lot for white families. And in fact, for African American families, they've stayed basically flat or gone down slightly. So again, when we ask ourselves who's thriving in Chicago, who's really having opportunity, we really need to pay attention to these kinds of measures. This is of course in part related to what kind of sectors that people are employed in. This is a kind of complicated graph, but what I want you to look at and juxtapose is the top light blue lines as compared to the rest. So the top light blue lines are those that we might think of as kind of professional, managerial, high-paying jobs. And we see that for white and Asian communities, the numbers are quite high. That's where a majority of people are employed. Whereas when we look at for African American, Latinx, other communities, they're much more likely to be employed in kind of lower wage sectors. And the consequences of this are many. One of the reasons we entitled the first report A Tale of Three Cities is that it's really important to understand different dynamics for different communities. So for instance, even though Latinx population in Chicago has a lower unemployment rate than African Americans, they are much more likely to be employed in jobs where they make very low wages. So here we look at over the last stretch of time where we had good data, we find that more than half of Latinx workers are making less than $15 an hour, which would sort of be a baseline of what we consider to be a living wage. So again, people are working more, but not necessarily working in living wage jobs. And sort of related to this is also the number of people who remain uninsured. Obviously, all of these numbers have huge consequences when we think about community level patterns of structural vulnerability to the coronavirus and its ramifications, including recognizing that within the city, it's particularly hit the Latinx and Black communities sort of related to these things. Now, a lot of the current uprisings in the city are related to thinking about questions about how we engage in policing in different communities. And so I want to share some of the data that we looked at for this in our reports. And one of the things that folks have raised in calling for defunding the police is about thinking about how we invest public dollars currently. And related to kind of national patterns of mass incarceration, one of the ways of looking at this is looking at which things we've invested more money, state dollars in over the last 50 years and what's gotten less. And this is just one way of looking at it. But it captures the huge increase in state investment in jailing, policing, court system, corrections, and at the same time that the public investment in many things that we think of as public goods, like hospitals and libraries and parks, have actually gone down. So the question is, what are the things that make communities feel safer, that help communities to thrive, and how do we invest in those kinds of things? Because one of the things we find, this is data we have that was produced by a group called DataMade. They calculated the amount of money that's spent on incarceration per block in the city of Chicago. And what you see, we're just showing you a few examples here to simplify. But what you see is that huge amounts of money are actually being invested in incarceration. So it's not that we don't have resources to support communities, and in particularly some of the communities that we think of as most impoverished, like Austin on the west side, we are spending almost $500 million on incarceration over a 5-year period. And I think that's the kind of resources that many people are saying might be better spent elsewhere. We are also spending in the city hundreds of millions of dollars over a decade period, literally $500 million on payments related to police misconduct. And this includes both damages, fees and costs, et cetera. You can see the numbers here. Some other folks have updated this more recently. It continues. And again, is a marker of, in some ways, how communities experience policing and the hyper-surveillance in their communities. Another way of looking at this is who experiences stops by the police. A lot of this data has been made public in recent years related to the federal reports and consent decrees. But you see here that African Americans in the city are much more likely to be stopped by the police. This graph actually shows kind of sort of related patterns in schools. I'll come back to this if I have time. But when we think about complaints filed against police for misconduct in some way, African Americans file far more complaints. Remember, they're about 30% of the city's population, and they're filing almost 2/3 of complaints against police. And despite that, their complaints are sustained on a much lower level. So again, all of these speak to many of the frustrations that we see communities expressing today about their relationship with the police department. If we look at incarceration rates overall, we see that after accounting for population size, the rate of incarceration of Black and brown folks in the state of Illinois is dramatically disproportional. So, and in fact, you know, some of this data is actually both from our first report and from the report on Native Americans, because even though Native Americans are a relatively small part of the population, they are far overrepresented still in terms of experiencing relationship with incarceration and the criminal legal system. So you see here that African Americans and Native Americans, men, or these are all groups, are far represented. And when we look at women in particular, this is one of the things that was most surprising to us in the work when we were doing the report on Native Americans in particular, that Black and brown women are also far overrepresented in prison, but Native American women in particular are really experiencing high levels of interaction with police, with the incarceration. Okay, I want to switch gears here a little bit. Obviously, there's lots of other data from our first report, and I'm able to only show some of it today. This data from our report on Asian Americans is really important for a lot of different reasons. Asian Americans are a relatively small part of the city. They're about 6% of the overall population, but they're the fastest growing group in the city. And they're important also because they're often presented as a group that shows for other people, they're held up as a kind of model minority that shows what all groups can do if they just applied themselves and work hard. And some of this is related to, if we looked at the patterns I showed earlier, it looks like Asian Americans overall are doing quite well. They have their median family incomes are relatively high. Their education rates appear to be fairly high. But one of the things that we found in our report is related to two kind of dueling racial mythologies or stereotypes that we held about Asian Americans. One is the stereotype of them as model minorities, and another, which is the competing stereotype of Asian Americans as being forever foreigner, as never being fully accepted as truly American. Some scholars have talked about this as the kind of way in which one can be held up in one moment as being a model minority and then be constructed as what they call yellow peril immediately after. And I'll tell you what that looks like in a second. But what we found is this data represented over and over again. I'll just hit some of the highlights. One of the things we found is that when we try to understand what's going on for Asian Americans in the city, it's really important to understand the diversity and disparity within this group. That we are pooling together many, many, many different groups that are having quite disparate experiences, such that, as you can see from this table, it looks a little complicated, but the main storyline here is that Asian Americans are both among the most educated groups in the city and among the least educated groups in the city. And those who are among the most educated groups in the city, it isn't about necessarily a cultural disposition towards education, but about H-1B visa laws and the fact that immigration laws, in fact, are, for the most part, aside from family reunification, only allowing those with very high levels of education to get visas to immigrate. So what we see is about 2/3 of Asian Americans in Chicago are immigrants. And for those who are immigrating to the United States, their rates of college degree and advanced degree are far higher than the average within the country that they're coming from, many, many times higher. So that these patterns for those who have, for instance, high incomes and stuff, are not so much about experiences within the US, but about who we are allowing to immigrate to the US. Another way to look at this, again, is look at median family incomes. And here you see that Asian Americans seem to be doing relatively well compared to a lot of other groups. But again, when we compare them within, when we disaggregate a little bit, we see that Asian Americans, some groups like South Asian Indians or Filipinos are among the highest paid groups in the city, and other groups are by far among the lowest paid. And this includes folks from South Asia, like Bangladesh, and from Southeast Asia, like Cambodians. So again, it highlights the importance of paying attention to the disparity. The other thing that we found in this report is that Asian Americans are dealing with lots of racial wage discrimination, meaning that they are not receiving the same returns to education as other groups. So for those with advanced degrees, they should be making far more than they are. And particularly for those who have any kind of accent, who don't speak English very well, that they're receiving a much higher wage penalty than, for instance, immigrants from Europe or other places who also have accents or don't speak English very well, but the costs to them are quite different. So there's lots of different examples of how these racial stereotypes actually are affecting all members of this group. This is also super relevant because I think what a lot of people saw at the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, was how quickly Asian Americans were subject to pervasive amounts of racial hostility, attacks. Some of this fed by national rhetoric around this being a Chinese virus of some kind. But you saw a lot of really ugly racial violence targeted towards Asian Americans. And this is, again, this kind of duality of being held up in some moments as being model minority, but always being subject to this sense that you're never fully American, even for people who might be, many generations in the US. Okay, I just want to briefly touch on our last two reports, and then I'm going to turn things over to Lisa and David. So we completed last year a report on the state of racial justice for American Indians in Chicago. This was a very important project for a number of reasons. This is a group that experiences in the city of Chicago both hypervisibility. When we look around the city, we see their images of Native Americans in museums, on statues, on our mascots for our teams, and that sort of thing. but they remain invisible in lots of other ways when people are trying to understand how different groups are faring in the city. There are many mythologies around Native Americans that in fact do great harm to them, including much of the you can see here some of the dioramas from museums and such that present this group as almost as if they don't exist today. And we, in fact, Chicago is a major population center for Native Americans in the Midwest. And I think what people don't often realize is that half of Native Americans nationally now live in cities. So the idea that most Native Americans live in rural populations is in fact not true. And I think some of the most troubling patterns that we see in Chicago, we're also seeing nationally now, with some of the highest rates of coronavirus and coronavirus death actually being in Native American communities, but much of that floating below the radar because of the way that we tend to ignore this group and see them as not part of the general polity. They also have very high rates of experiences of police violence. And in fact, per capita have more experiences, more Native Americans are killed by the police every year than any other group. So again, really important to pay attention in terms of thinking about the things happening right now to the full scope of experiences. The last thing I want to talk about is a report we issued recently, which sort of echoes a lot of this data. And it explored, people had been talking about for a while about the exodus of African Americans out of the city. I already talked about some of the data, which helps explain where we're coming from and gives context for why some folks might be leaving. But when we approached this story, we said, well, there's this narrative that African Americans are leaving. And the question for us was, if we look over a long stretch of time, really what are population trends in the city? And I'll just show you a few. And what you see here is that African American population grew pretty rapidly during the period of the Great Migration between the 1920s up until the 1980s. And then my population stopped, and eventually, I'll actually show you here, you can see when the population grew or declined from decade to decade. And you see from decade, like you see through the 60s to the 80s, a major period of white flight in the city. And then you see African Americans leaving. And the main thing that we found when looking at this, I won't have time to show you all the data points today, is that African Americans migrated to Chicago when it was a place of opportunity for Black folks. When there were job prospects were good, when relative to the South, there was more opportunity here for them along economic lines. And when that stopped being true around 1980, around 1980 is when we see unemployment rates increase for Blacks, we see the racial wage gap increase. That's when folks both stopped coming and started leaving. And partly we don't see that in the overall population because for several decades, that was periods of major influx of Latinx folks. And it's only in the last decade or so that we've seen this true. It is interesting, though, often for folks to think about why we're paying so much attention to it now, because in fact, the last 10 years, there was pretty much not much population leaving, but it was really something that was happening 10 and 20 years ago. One more slide. I think I have about 1 minute left in my time. We see that Black-white segregation levels in Chicago remain among the highest of any city in the country. And the last kind of myth I want to dispel is one that people often say, well, Black folks are leaving because they're moving back to the South or moving to Atlanta or moving other places. And one of the things that we find is that Black people are actually really rooted in the metropolitan area, that over half of the folks that have left remain in the state of Illinois. And if not in Illinois, they're in Northwest Indiana or in Wisconsin. You can see for both Black and white movers, the top 10 places they're ending up are primarily in the metro area. You have to go down to 7 or 8 before you get something else. And that's true both when we think about the states that folks are moving to. So you see over 50% of folks are staying nearby. And so people are really grounded in the area. And I think for us, it raises the question over and over again, how are we going to make this a Chicago that really serves everybody here and that helps everybody thrive, rather than a Chicago that serves some communities far better than others. And I will wrap up there. I look forward to questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Lee, who I think has some slides to share. Lisa, I think you're still muted.
Yeah, I would love to be able to turn my video on. And
I think you should be able to now, Lisa.
Hi,
Great.
everyone. I'm really happy to be here tonight. And thank you so much for taking time out of, I'm sure, a lot of Zoom options that you might have to join us for this particular Zoom. And also, I'm really thrilled and excited to be part of the UIC and the IRPP community at this moment of time. So much of the activism and on the ground organizing, the sort of brilliant demands of activists to defund the police would not have been possible without the scholarship and the engaged sort of activism of people like Professor Stovall, Professor Lewis, and also people like Barbara Ransby and Beth Ritchie, who are all here at UIC. So it's actually a really important moment in the sort of civic work of this country. So as Amanda mentioned, I am also the director of the National Public Housing Museum. And so I'm gonna actually show lots of slides because I'm in the Department of Art History and that's how we roll. Great. All right, so here we are. The Public Housing Museum, for those of you who do not know, is actually going to be located in the last remaining building of the Jane Addams Homes, which is actually right near UIC at 1322 Taylor Street. There's a beautiful public library across the street, and it's really near UIC. And my work at UIC is really as a professor in museum and exhibition studies, also in thinking about how culture can be the space of social transformation. And I always like to begin with this quote by Jeff Chang, a scholar, a hip hop scholar, and also public historian, who reminds us of the importance of cultural change and how it often precedes political change, and how we also in these moments of a lot of policy conversations need to take these big leaps of radical imagination and creativity in order to really not just critique the society as it is, but to imagine the world that we want to live in. I'm going to start with this image, which is such a powerful one, and it's one of the last remaining buildings coming down at Cabrini Green. And when I say the words Cabrini Green, it stirs the imagination. Cabrini Green was the setting of the television sitcom Good Times, and also the Hollywood horror film Candyman. And it became synonymous with all of the growing problems associated with not just public housing in the United States, but also with stereotypes about what it meant to be poor and Black in America. Some of you may remember that the Saturday Night Live show even had a skit about a teenage single mother whose name was Cabrini Green Harlem Watts Jackson. But due to a long and deeply racialized history, public housing and the people who live there have often been regarded with deep suspicion and resentment. More than 40 years ago, at a campaign rally in 1976, Ronald Reagan introduced the term welfare queen into the public conversation about poverty. And this pernicious caricature has often persisted. And the mythical figure of someone living large and benefiting from government handouts has frequently eclipsed the realities. Now, in this particular contemporary moment, where every single major corporation in the United States is begging for a government handout, it also is a moment for us to sort of ask, what is the role in government in helping to create the change that we need to see? What is not often remembered when people think about those living in public housing are sort of the joy of those who lived there and created friends and families and created brilliant networks of support. You don't remember the sort of terrible tenements and the conditions of housing that existed in Chicago and across the country before public housing was created. You sort of don't really see the interiors of the spaces. This is one of the early housing apartments in Cabrini Green, of like sort of the pianos and the families who lived in public housing. You're not thinking about the sort of multiracial groups that often lived there and played there and created bonds. You're not thinking about the sort of garden clubs and sort of the house and garden awards that a lot of the public housing residents sort of won in that particular period. And in my field, we often talk about the quote of John Berger, a great art historian, who said, "Never again will a single story be told as if it's the only one." And that's a lot about what my work is at UIC, and also something which is, I think, an important reminder now as we're thinking about the narratives and the stories of how we think about what is happening now, not just in COVID, but happening, during the sort of the George Floyd deaths and other moments. In public housing, I think one of the fascinating stories about Cabrini Green that I always like to remind people is that there was a huge population of Japanese families that lived in Cabrini Green because the United States opened up Cabrini to families who were living in internment camps, who were, imprisoned in internment camps, and sort of said, if you would like to come to Chicago and clean the houses of white families who prefer Asians, you can actually live in Cabrini. And so that's also part of the story. And all of these families that live in public housing then and also now began to sort of face a myriad of problems and struggles, including police acting with impunity and brutality, sort of disinvestment in their neighborhoods due to urban renewal policies that privilege some communities while negatively impacting others, and all the crumbling buildings that we remember because they were due to tons of deferred maintenance. And over time, systemic forms of racism, including federally sponsored systems of segregation, like redlining, and also the growth of the prison industrial complex, made the demographics of public housing, which were very multiracial and mixed in the beginning, to become one of almost an exclusively African-American community, like Cabrini Green. And in this current moment, where so many of us are sheltering at home, the issue of housing insecurity, of those who do not have a home because they are homeless, those who cannot afford the rent because they desperately need rent relief because they've lost their job and they're now facing eviction, and those who also live in another form of public housing, America's prisons, has been brought into really sharp focus to us. And there's a demand and necessity for us to understand the history of housing in the United States, and also to embrace safe and affordable housing as a human right, as part of our collective future, to imagine a more just and equitable world for all of us. Housing has often been at the front of struggles. And so, for example, there's, countless moments where people have recognized that rent increases have been at the sort of crux of problems in their neighborhood. And, this is an image from Oakland and the Black Panther newspaper, which talks about, how important the relationship between controlling rent is to actually being able to influence policing, influencing education in the schools, and also sort of having community empowerment. In my own work, I sort of grapple with the history of public housing and try to challenge the mainstream narratives and look to the counter narratives that scholars like Richard Rothstein, Rhonda Williams, and Roberta Feldman and other people have put forth to really sort of understand the histories of resilience and resistance of the people of public housing who were dealing with these systems of racial and economic injustice. And something that I just want to sort of point out is that initially public housing, came from the Housing Act of 1937, and it was a program that gave federal loans to all state and local authorities to build housing. And the language of the Housing Act said that it was the goal of government to provide a decent home and suitable living environment for every American family. People don't know that Catherine Bauer Worcester was one of the lead writers of the landmark Housing Act. And she, was part of 5 different administrations. She was often the only woman in the room. And, she never wavered in her conviction that government had not only the power, but the responsibility to fix the housing situation in the United States. And sort of the last sort of historical point that I really want to bring up, because I do believe as a historian that we need to go upstream to solve our problems. And for me, going upstream means going back in time and asking critical questions about what do we not yet learn from history? What do we need to do? And also, what do we need to reparate and remediate the past wrongs? And, you know, one of the most important past wrongs that has been done to communities of color is this history of redlining, which people are hearing a lot more about. And this is a map from the Owners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, which was around a little bit more than 80 years ago, a federal agency that created these residential security maps for all American cities. And these maps documented how loan officers, appraisers, and real estate professionals should evaluate mortgage lending and the risk, you know, during that sort of period in the 1950s. And certain neighborhoods were considered high risk or hazardous, and they were redlined. And these were the neighborhoods where even if there was just one African-American family living there, then they would redline that neighborhood, and it was seen as sort of undesirable, right? And redlining is one of the myriad ways that African-Americans experience discrimination in the housing market. And it was a federal government sanctioned project that actually disinvested in Black neighborhoods and urban centers. And this is something which has completely contributed to the issues that we see today and that we're experiencing, not only with sort of health disparities and sort of the deaths in COVID, but also in policing and other things. I'm just going to say one more quick history that I think is incredibly important to remember, and because it's a Chicago history. And this is sort of the moment that Dr. Martin Luther King came to Chicago for the Chicago Freedom Movement. And many people only think of his work, you know, in the South, American South, but after his work in Mississippi with the Freedom Riders, he came to Chicago to raise awareness about the poor housing conditions in our city. And he moved into an apartment in Chicago's West Side in Lawndale, and here he is with Coretta Scott King at 1550 South Hamlin. This is them working to clean up apartments. And during this time, he marched to City Hall, pinned up a set of demands for fair mortgages, the end of slums, affordable housing, and demands to end segregation in Chicago. And he was faced with crowds like this. And on August 5th, in 1966, in Marquette Park, King was planning to lead a march to realtors' office to demand properties be sold to everyone, regardless of their race. The mood was ominous, and he was swarmed by 700 white protesters hurling bricks, bottles, firecrackers, and rocks. And someone hurled a rock that struck him on the head. And, you know, he said, I've never seen demonstrations in the South as, you know, so as hostile and hateful as I've seen here. It was so much worse in Chicago than anywhere in the South. And this is history that, you know, we need to come to terms with and embrace. And really, you know, try to figure out what is the role in housing in all of the issues that are happening now. And then the last thing I just want to say is, you know, initially in the founding of Chicago by Daniel Burnham, when he did the 1909 plan for Chicago, he created a beautiful plan that many people, you know, herald where you make no small plans. But he actually came to Jane Addams at the Hull House, which is now at the UIC campus, because he had forgotten one little thing he thought, but he needed to solve for this plan. And it was that he went to her and said, you know, I've made the perfect plan for Chicago, but where do the poor people live? In his entire plan, he had actually not included any plan for housing, you know, and it was one of those, you know, things that urban planners often forget about. And, you know, this is one of those markers in this moment where, as we're talking more about investing in neighborhoods, something Mayor Lori Lightfoot has talked about, you know, we need to be bold, ambitious, and not just remember, you know, and to ask, where do the poor people live, but to also address why people are poor in the first place and to embrace housing as a human right. Great, I'm gonna stop there. I have to stop my share. Cool, thanks.
Oh, peace and greetings, everybody. Again, my name is Dave Stovall, and I'm in Black Studies and Criminology, Law and Justice. And thank you so much, Lisa, for actually giving us an understanding of what it is that we're actually in here in Chicago. And thank you, Amanda, for actually giving us this broad overview around where the data is showing us chronologically and historically what has been happening in particular communities. I think it's important for the viewers to engage a couple of things, right? So if we look at the current moment of unrest, we are in a moment where people have declared that the current moment is enough, right? Karl Marx talks about revolution occurs when people find their conditions intolerable. Given the data that you've just seen, that is a description of an intolerable condition. And when we understand our conditions to be intolerable, then people actually respond in particular ways that are not to the liking of the state, right? And when I say the state, I'm not just talking about the city of Chicago, but any type of government that is charged with actually governing or distributing particular goods and services to the people. And I think at this particular moment, it's important for us to understand the connectivity between issues like housing, healthcare, employment, education, food delivery. And I think when we put those things in conversations with each other, now we can understand when people have declared their conditions to be intolerable. And what I want to talk to you all about a little bit today is schools, right? So I think it's important for us to put into context what schooling has meant in Chicago. And schooling has always been a contested space for Black people. And the contestation has always occurred around what would be taught and where would people go to school, right? So Lisa and Amanda just laid out for us that Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the country, if not the world. And in that segregation, there were certain schools that Black people could go to. And it's important to note that between the years of 1935 and 1957, 80% of all Black people in Chicago lived in an area of 8 square miles, right? So, I mean, it's important to put that in context. When we talk about overcrowding, when you talk about situations where people are in these places that are extremely disinvested or resources have been removed from them, now we have to ask a particular question around what is the state of schooling in Chicago. And it's, again, because it's always been contested for Black people. There have been people who have had worthwhile educational experiences, and then there have been people who have had experiences where they have been criminalized before they have been thought of as human. So here in Chicago in the early 2000s, we had police stations in particular high schools. And when I say police stations, I mean operative police stations where young people could be booked before they actually would go to central booking on 26 in California. We now have a current moment where many schools have lost populations, where some schools are operating at anywhere from 20 to 30% of its original population. And when Amanda talked about depopulation, this is the current moment and how this depopulation has resulted in, on the school side, when people have now left schools and those resources have actually traveled with them. And I think it's important because when we pair housing, and one of my colleagues always reminds me that housing is an education issue and education is a housing issue. So largely where people go to school, you will actually see a shift in what the housing looks like. And I think it becomes important when we talk about Chicago, because once neighborhoods have been deemed Black, densely populated, or heavily populated with crime, then there is the response by the state to police them in a very particular way. And when we talk about the current moment, there are people who are exasperated with the way that they have been contained and marginalized. Now, some people refer to that as policing, but actually what it is containment and marginalization. You have been kept out of particular areas, and you have been kept out of particular areas in particular ways. And I'll give you all one example. I was talking to a retired police officer, and he found out about the work that I do with young folks and families. And he understood that I did work around looking at housing and its relationship to education. And he said this thing to me, and it always stuck with me. He said, look, Stovall, I understand what you do. He said, but I want to tell you something. He said, I want to tell you how to make a killer. And I looked at him and said, okay, what does that comprise? And he said, look, if you don't have a viable place to live, a viable place to go to school, you have been denied health care, what is the expectation? And more importantly, what happens when you hire me with the sole purpose of containing you? And in that containment, the hope is that you will implode on each other before you actually go anywhere else. So my job is to contain you in your practice of violence against each other. And we just saw this in terms of some struggles over the last couple of weeks, where there was some Black on brown violence, brown on Black violence, where police officers were actually talking about the practices that they would use to contain people so that they would shoot each other, right? So again, we're no longer talking about things to be conspiratorial, right? We're actually on police blotters, hearing them talking about how to contain the shooting with the hope that they will actually contact each other. So if we couple this with egregious police violence, the city of Chicago has settled almost over $500 million in settlements around police violence over the last 15 years. So if we think about this particular moment, and when you think about the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor that are now being publicized, we now in Chicago go back to Rekia Boyd and Laquan McDonald. We live in a city where a mayor covered up a murder to run an election and then release the tapes that he did not want to release. And I think it's important to talk about that. And he was never charged with obstruction of justice. So if we understand that we actually live under these conditions, then what is the expectation when people see their own death repeatedly? So again, when we understand what's happening and what's been happening over the last couple of weeks, we need to understand three pandemics: the pandemic of a global health situation, the pandemic of white supremacy, and the pandemic of capitalism. So now when these converge on each other, the results are people finding their conditions intolerable. And I want to end on this because I think it's important to where people can now begin to think about what's happening. A lot of situations, and now people are hearing the term abolition and they're becoming confused by it. And when we talk about abolition, we are talking about abolishing the conditions that dehumanize people. So now if we think about the abolishing of the conditions that dehumanize people, then we have to think about things like grades in schools. What would it mean to have a system that no longer had grades? No one has died because they don't have access to an AP exam. But there have been many Black people who have died to COVID who have also had inequitable and substandard education systems. So now when we think about the elimination of things like grades, or the elimination of high stakes testing that is rooted in white supremacy and eugenics, we can now begin to think about different approaches to engage populations who understand their current condition to be intolerable, right? And now when we even start to think about decarceration, I think it's important for us to think about one thing in particular. 80% of all cases in the United States that are adjudicated in the criminal legal system never go to trial. They are decided by plea bargain. Now, when a person actually goes to jail, and if they are employed, of course they can't work. If you eliminate cash bail, you do two things. One, you drastically reduce the jail population. Second, you provide the opportunity for folks to actually get legal assistance, in many cases at a low cost. So if you look at decarceration, at the elimination of cash bail, depending on where you are, you could reduce prison populations anywhere from 30 to 40% in the first 2 years. So now when people are talking about abolition and the non-reformist reform steps to get us to abolition, I think now we need to understand what these are and the practical practices that we can engage, because it's not this far off thing. And remember, these have been intolerable conditions and time immemorial. So now, if we're going to shift those conditions, these are the things that we need to consider moving forward. I'll stop there. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you for all three of you. This has been incredibly enlightening and just very powerful. I think we have time for a few questions, if you're all okay with that. We had one that was submitted ahead of time, and I would encourage our participants to use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom if they'd like to add additional questions. But the pre-question, and a couple of you actually touched upon this, but if you wouldn't mind expanding, how will the city of Chicago improve vast disparities in housing, income, and schools across neighborhoods directly caused by unfair policies such as redlining, which I know Professor Lee, you specifically addressed? I don't know if one of you would like to take that.
I'll say a few things, and then if they want to add on. I think that's one of the powerful things. I think when people hear defund the police, they just often respond in a kind of reaction. But I think what one way of thinking about it is that the city of Chicago spends a huge amount of money on a practice that doesn't actually make a lot of folks feel safe. And so one of the things that we are talking about in rethinking how we spend our public resources is what are the ways that the city could be investing in communities to actually serve Chicago's citizens writ large, including the things that Lisa and David talked about. What would it mean if we provided quality housing to people? What would it mean if we provided high quality education across the city? And in fact, there's lots of evidence that we do have the resources for these things if we just shifted how we were spending public resources. So that would be one way of thinking about it. There's also a lot of evidence, and Lisa mentioned this, that a lot of communities in the city actually become quite wealthy through the process of extraction. There was a very powerful report last year by a center at Duke, along with some folks at the Voorhees Center in UIC, about contact leasing in the city, in which in some communities in the city, 75 to 80% of those African Americans who bought houses over many decades did so through this very exploitative contact leasing system that essentially where they weren't actually buying the house, where they actually paid over many, many years and then lost control of the house. And there were folks in downtown Chicago that were making millions of dollars off this practice. So I think one of the things that we also need to pay attention to is how resources have been taken out of communities that need them the most, and what it would mean to actually think about a process of restoration or reparations where we actually think about reinvesting even more in these communities that have experienced this kind of thing. I don't know if David or Lisa wants to add.
Just something real quick. The city of Chicago has, and this is a strange thing, where city entities actually have contracts with each other. So the city of Chicago, Chicago Public Schools has a $33 million contract with the Chicago Police Department. Now, let's think about this. If you redirected that $33 million to counselors, wraparound services, art, athletics, and any other particular needs that students and families have identified, you could have a particular affect on Chicago Public Schools. But again, the reappropriation of those dollars, and I think this becomes important because that type of reappropriation would allow people to actually center communities that have historically been on the margin, who have historically had the least, and now bring them into the fold and prioritize them. I think this is important because we live in a city. Chicago is a city where certain populations are deemed valuable while others have been deemed disposable. And those disposable populations are often Black and poor. So we now have to think about what does it mean to bring folks, that marginalized population, into the center and the focus of our work, right? Not as transient, but as long-term populations, and rethinking how we actually begin to address these concerns. And that's just an example from schooling.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly say, I mean, we need to be really astute students of budgets also. And, David mentioned some of these numbers, but our current city budget in Chicago has $151 million set aside just for police misconduct settlements, right? Like, that's a big number. And also asking ourselves, what does it mean to defund the police, and what could we do with those resources, is like a really, really important things for us to sort of be a part of, like participatory budget practices, which is something that a lot of communities are calling for. And also I'll just say two short things, which is one, listen, we are at a public university, one of the great public universities in our country. And the sort of question of the public good, what it means to have a public sphere worthy of its name, is really critical at this moment. And to have housing and some of these things that we're asking the question, like health, as a public good rather than a private commodity, is something that we need to grapple with as a nation. And people at UIC should be at the forefront, charging and making this claim in what should be a public good at this moment. The other thing is that I would just quote sort of Ella Baker, but it's something that Jane Addams also said, which is that the people with the problems are the people with the solutions, right? Like, it's not that we're going to go into like locked doors and ask sort of developers in the city or the mayor or anybody to actually solve these things for us, but actually communities know the answers to what they need, what their families need, and they really need to be not just centered, but they need to be have a seat at the table and be helping to run the conversation, because these solutions are actually out there, and it's all hands on deck. These are policy issues, but I myself am a cultural historian, and it's all hands on deck. Architects have a role to play in this moment. Artists have a role to play, art historians. It's really every single person needs to contribute to this change.
I'm going to jump slightly out of order because I think the next question follows well with what you just said. The question is, what initiatives are presently underway or planned within UIC to address racial justice and education for UIC students?
Right. There has currently been a list of demands that have been issued to administration by students. And I think one of the things that comes out of that demand, and when we talk specifically about Black students at UIC, the Black population of UIC has remained flat for about the last 10 years, probably anywhere, oscillates between about 8.5% and 10%. Now, this is in a city where the Black population is 30%. So one of the things that students have asked for is an increase in recruitment and retention of Black students by 50%, right? And again, think about that, right? That's not a big ask in a broader scope of things, right? It's literally going up from 8% to 16%, right? So that's not a large piece. But this other thing is around, one of the other pieces in the demands is asking or demanding that they have authentic community relationships with community organizations, and actually have community organizations access UIC for free, right? And I think this becomes important when we talk about practices of abolition and these kind of non-reformist reforms in the meantime around a public university should always be publicly accessible. And I think this is one of the things that students have put forward. And they've also made demands around financial aid packages, recruitment of students, and the admissions process. So those are some of the demands that have been put forward, but I think they are tangible ones that I think are critically important, not just at this juncture, because a lot of times, and I think this is important for the audience, a lot of times universities can become reactionary to the moment. And what the students are asking is that people be definitive in their decisions for these practices long term. And I think that's always the read, because what administrations will try to do is wait students out because the population is deemed transient because people are graduating or what have you. But the thing that I think is critically important about those demands is that they are talking about, and so I'm really proud of the students for making this, because they are talking about demands that outreach their time at UIC for permanence in terms of outreach to various communities. So I think that's critically important at the moment. It's something that's been happening, and those demands have been issued to the administration.
With some very specific measurable outcomes. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I would just say also that, in this particular COVID moment where so much online teaching is happening, there also is a little bit of a potential. Like, for example, we're very proud of the fact that we are so many of our students are first generation college, sort of graduates, but, why not open up our classes to the parents who might also be able to take part in education and also get a degree? There's just sort of, we're treating our education as a limited commodity also, as opposed to a public good. And I think this is something that a lot of different universities are thinking through about who we make our classes available to, not just, the parents, but also people who are in prison, and a much more expanded definition of who our community is.
Thank you. I'm going to go on to the next question, which is, how are Black women impacted where the benefit of family through incarceration of Black men is constrained?
Yeah, I think and I'm trying to get I was looking at that question also. I was trying to get some clarity on it, and I'll try to address it. And if I'm not clear, then the person who proposed the question, please let me know. And I think this is important to put forward, and Amanda put this in the front of the presentation. When we talk about incarceration, we often think about the main target of incarceration to be Black men. And that is where we have the majority of our problem in terms of our analysis of it, because the population that has increased the most in terms of incarceration has been Black women. And I think a lot of times when we don't have that particular analysis, we often think that the target of incarceration is Black men. But if we look, and Beth Ritchie, one of our colleagues here at UIC, often point out, is that the population of Black women who have been incarcerated has increased 700% since 1970, right? So it's outpaced the incarceration of Black men. And I think this is a particular moment, especially when we talk about George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Black women being disappeared in cities, that the gaze is often to male identified people. And when we now take a step back, it's important for us to put women identified folks in this equation. And when we don't do that, we get a misconstrued understanding of incarceration, right? Same thing with school suspensions, right? The group that is outpacing all groups across the country in terms of school suspensions have been Black girls, right? So this thing around, really, I think it's important that our gender analysis begin to reflect how we understand this particular moment, because a lot of times the adage is Black men are incarcerated, Black women are left to carry the load. Now that situation has raised up where both populations are now facing incarceration, and then young folks are often left to grandparents who become responsible for child rearing, or in the worst case scenarios are placed in the care of the state, right? So I think, again, really pushing ourselves to understand incarceration in a very different way, because over the last 30 years, it has shifted deeply for Black women.
Can also just quickly say that on a sort of different kind of positive note, the sort of incarceration that happened in the 80s in the United States also led to a lot of incredibly fierce Black feminist leaders and organizers who emerged out of places like public housing, because so many of the men male were actually incarcerated. And, that's, Hallie Amy, Miss Stamps, and still, Francine Washington, who's still, sort of organizing in the city. And they presented a really different model for what a leader should look like. There's a really wonderful book called The Dignity of Resistance. It was also written by a UIC professor, Roberta Feldman, which documents the sort of rise of Black feminist leaders because of this issue. And I think they formed really interesting solutions that we can and should be looking towards. New definitions of public safety, which included sort of wellness checks on elders, extended definitions of families so that it was chosen family, not just nuclear families, that people who cared for one another, and also different kinds of solidarity economies that emerged out of like public housing, and a lot in Chicago, which was like cooperatives that were challenging Black capitalism and sort of saying, let's actually create different models of economics that can actually benefit all of us and empower the community. And so, it's important to also hold up and remember these moments in history, which was an impact also of what was happening.
Thank you. I think we have time for just 2 more questions. So the next question is, what needs to be done to open up the suburbs to people of color? It's multi-pronged. Why do big cities like Chicago bear the brunt of these social upheavals while the prominently white suburbs get off scot-free? The person says they are thinking of requiring rezoning to allow for low-rise multifamily market rate housing.
Well, I'll just start by saying one thing. I think we have this kind of historic understanding of, chocolate cities and vanilla suburbs. But in fact, the suburbs around Chicago, and nationally, actually, huge numbers of Black, Latino, and Asian folks actually live in the suburbs. It is true that the suburbs themselves are also very segregated. So we have older inner-ring suburbs where there are fewer resources and that sort of thing. So the challenges we see in the city of Chicago around segregation, around the way that resources are unevenly distributed, I think persist into the suburbs. So it's not so much that the suburbs don't have folks, it's just that they tend to live in quite different suburbs. I mean, you can drive, for instance, in the South along the 57 corridor, and on the east side is almost entirely Black, and on the west side is almost entirely white. So a lot of the patterns around discriminatory housing policies, I think zoning is a huge issue, and a lot of these things have played out historically both in the suburbs and in the city. So I'll start with that. I don't know if David and Lisa want to add.
Well, Lisa, you know this in particular ways, and a lot of folks who study housing talk about this. Chicago was, the 5-collar county, Chicago in the 5-collar county area was the place where a landmark court decision happened that was deeply unsuccessful. And it was called the Gautreaux decision, right? And the Gautreaux decision was that would put Black families in particular out in predominantly white suburbs with the understanding that they would have greater access to resources. What we found out over a 40-year period was that those Black families experienced a greater sense of isolation in those spaces, right? So I don't ever think that a suburban solution is key in this. I think what we have to draw down deep to is this understanding around who's valuable and who's disposable, right? And who is this city for? Because I think this is the landmark space. When we start to think about who the city is for, now we start to see those patterns. And Janet Smith here at UIC developed in the early 2000s what they referred to, her and Rachel Ruppert referred to as the gentrification index, right? So now this thing around, so suburbs aren't necessarily the solution. They have resources or what have you, but they do very little to address senses of isolation, right? And I think if we're talking about a vibrant city, then we have to begin to think about who is deemed valuable in that particular city, and to what extent are they allowed to remain with the resources that they need? And that's always been the contestation in Chicago.
Yeah, I love the question. And I think it was framed also so smartly because there's a really beautiful book by Dolores Hayden called The Grand Domestic Revolution. And it looks at the sort of birth of suburbs and sort of the complicity of the real estate industry and also big corporations like General Electric, which were really, it wasn't just about sort of flight from the city, but also sort of the promotion of single family homes in order to sell, you know, sort of stoves and refrigerators and things like that. And, you know, at this critical moment later on, like during the GI Bill, when there were tons of, you know, soldiers coming back from the war, there was a big debate about whether they should be building more public housing, not just in the city, but also in suburbs, so that it wasn't just single family homes, but a lot of people to deal with the isolation, to be building different kinds of complexes for people to live in. But the actual real estate industry won out, and they sort of said, no, you should not be building more public housing. Instead, let's give GIs low interest mortgages to buy homes. But of course, we found out too that only was sort of white GIs that actually were able to take advantage of those things. But this idea that perhaps the suburbs could be a space for us to imagine different kind of housing and different kind of communities, I think it's super interesting and something that people should deal with. But, you know, and also I think this question comes up a lot in policing when people are like, what would it look like if we defunded the police and the police weren't there? Well, my daughter lives part-time with my ex in Wilmette. And I'm like, it looks like Wilmette. Like, it looks like our suburbs, right? Like the amount of sort of surveillance, and so we can probably look to the suburbs and sort of say, right, this is one of those spaces where defunding the police has actually worked. And let's borrow some of those tactics and put them into our cities. So there needs to be a much different definition of what the suburbs can and should be, and what should we be valuing in them, right? So.
Great, thank you. I lost my video, so I'm sorry about that. But just for the last question, the person asked, how do I get involved and how do I become part of the change? So if maybe all three of you could give some comments on that, that would be wonderful.
I think one of the things when you are entering space is to remember entering space where people are organizing themselves and demanding justice. One of the things that you have to remember is your humility upon entering those spaces. Help or helping people is temporary. What we're talking about now is solidarity. So how can you support folks who are actually doing this type of work? And there are a couple of organizations that are doing some really important work, I feel, around looking at different ways of understanding the current moment. One is the Chicago Bond Fund, which is in the Chicago Community Bond Fund, which actually is looking at processes of decarceration and actually pushing for the elimination of cash bail. Another space is the Children and Family Justice Center that are looking at cases where young people have been falsely accused, they have been given exorbitant sentences, where that actually have always been looking for support. There are organizations like Ujima Medics who have community approaches to healthcare and wellness. So it's a group of organizers and healthcare workers who began to start teaching community members on how to treat gunshot wounds, right? So, and then that expanded out into wellness. The last organization is the National Alliance Against Political Repression, who are pushing for a bill for what is referred to as the Community Police CPAC, which is the Community Policing Advisory Committee, which is critically important because when we talk about defunding police and reimagining police, one of the things that comes up is if the police responsibility is to the people of the city, then the people of the city should have the hire and firing power of that particular entity. And I think CPAC is a way for us to rethink how policing operates in the city. So those are just some organizations that were doing some work and looking to those spaces. But the thing that I would warn folks against, never walking into a space and say, hey, I'm here to help. We don't need that. We need folks who are willing to understand how they themselves either participate in or reject the instances of white supremacy, right? So before you enter a space, I think you need to be clear around the ways in which you either participate in the process of reifying white supremacy or rejecting it. And I think when we do that self-study, it makes our entry into those spaces much smoother.
Well, maybe I'll just say something quickly so that Amanda can have the last word. I agree with Professor Stovall that solidarity and not service is the most important thing. There's like this billboard that you see that it says, you know, if you ever wondered what you would do during slavery or during the Holocaust, you're doing it. And I mean, I think that this is a watershed moment in our particular historic moment, and it is so important for all of us to become engaged. And Movement for Black Lives has a website and actions. Juneteenth is coming up this Friday, and so it's a really important historic marker, and there are a lot of actions. But it's also a moment where not just being in the streets is not the only thing that you can or should be doing. Giving resources, if you have them, is not the only thing that you can or should be doing. Those are really important examples that Professor Stovall gives. But, I would sort of say that, really become an astute student of history and try to understand this moment that we're in. It's not, we didn't just suddenly come here, and there's a lot of sort of scholarship that's out there that is really important to sort of engage with at this moment. And there are some really incredible groups that are not just dismantling white supremacist organizations, but they're building sort of new institutions that are radically transforming not just Chicago, but our country. And so I'll just call out maybe, for example, Grow Greater Englewood, which Anton Seals is a part of, is really leading the land trust movement to decommodify land and to rethink sort of what a neighborhood can and should look like. I think it's a really amazing organization, and to find out about the history of land trusts. And Juwanza Malone is another great activist who is part of the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization that is really pushing community benefits agreements with not just corporations like Target, but also big nonprofits like the University of Chicago and the Obama Presidential Center, which really are, at the cusp of, terrible gentrification practices of neighborhoods. And so find out about these tools and mechanisms for creating change, and then just look around you, because there are organizations that are pushing for that. And then I would be really remiss if I didn't sort of also say, support institutions like the National Public Housing Museum and find out how to engage, because we need new cultural institutions which are committed to justice, are thinking about how to link housing with policing, with education, and creating new kinds of civic spaces for people to really be committed to the world that we want to create together. So.
I think the only thing I would add to that, I agree with everything that David and Lisa said, is that all of us are involved in organizations, either the ones we work in or the ones we send our kids to, the neighborhoods we live in. And all of those places have lots of space and room for intervention. So there's lots of, we have seen lots of organizing going on in communities around questions of racial justice and equity in schools. There's lots of work going on in organizations around the city, not just looking outward, but looking inward. And so I think as well as supporting these larger movements and activism and participating where one can, I think every one of us has a lot of space to look carefully at the organizations and spaces that we're in, and to think seriously about whether those spaces and organizations are advancing racial equity and racial justice, or in fact exacerbating things, and to do that in community. So I encourage people regularly to find other people to work with. This isn't work that one does alone. As David said, to get in solidarity with organizations that are already functioning, and to build new organizations in your community if there isn't one locally. And I think we need to think about this as work that belongs to all of us, that all of us are responsible for doing this work. and to invest our time and our energy and where our values are in trying to, as I said at the very beginning, make this as Chicago, make this a country that actually works for everyone. So thanks.
I forgot to say one thing, and I have to say it, otherwise the sort of organization I'm working with will be so mad at me. You know, I mean, Amanda mentioned the sort of movement around monuments and memorials. And, you know, for those of you who are still in Chicago, Chicago is one of the last US cities that has not had a public reckoning about our monuments and memorials. And, you know, this is a moment, there was just violence in the street today around the Columbus statue. But I would say that, you know, we need to be pushing our city to actually take account of our built environment and create a much more inclusive and just space for all of us. And there is a sort of project of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorials, which is fighting for a memorial that was part of the historic reparations bill that was passed around 5 years ago, to create a memorial and a space to bring about justice for people who were tortured under the Burge regime in Chicago. And so please look up CTJM, find out about it, and also, you know, push for our built environment in our city to actually reflect all of us and to be, you know, sort of in line with, you know, the 21st century. So that's the last thing I'll say.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all three of you. This has been such an incredibly important conversation, very thought-provoking, and we are very, very grateful to all three of you for sharing all of your thoughts and knowledge with us this evening. Next week, please plan to join us on Tuesday, June 23rd for our next UAC Alumni Exchange event at 6 p.m. Central, featuring UAC alumna Liz Herrera, who will walk us through an interactive discussion as she presents on job search strategies during COVID-19. We hope that you will join us for all of our upcoming alumni exchange events, and you can find more information on how to register at go.uac.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please do be on the lookout for that survey that I mentioned at the beginning. Thank you again to all three of our panelists and for this very important conversation. We are very, very grateful for your time, and we look forward to seeing all of you again in the alumni exchange. Thanks so much and have a great evening.
Thanks so much.